Book 4, Falcon in the Barn, Chapter 2. I know everything that goes on here in Edge. Perrin stared out the northeast window of his private office in the tower and came to some conclusions. The problem with Shem, Mari, Jatsi, Pato, the fort, with everybody really, was that they couldn't see. But Perrin could. He could see them in the shadows, staring from the trees, going for cover behind a door, under a desk, into a shop, through a barn. Shem said his mind was confusing him. Mari said it was nightmares. His children said nothing. But he knew the truth. He was surrounded by garters, masquerading as cats. Not literal cats. It wasn't as if he was insane, but citizens looked at him, then looked again. Some were new, who claimed they were from the ruined village of Moorland. Others said they were visiting relatives to help with rebuilding, or on their way to somewhere else, although Edge wasn't on the way to anywhere else. He'd spin around and there they'd go, ducking behind a building or tree, and when he chased after them, they were already gone. He changed his routines, patrolling different roads in patterns he'd never used before. And he stared into the eyes of those cats, those collaborators who Kay and Thorne had mentioned to Shem when he thought Perrin was dazed and presumably deaf from grief in the carriage, sent to the barn at Edge to keep an eye on the trapped and wounded falcon named Perrin Shin. And someday his family would believe him about the cats, if they weren't already dead. Colonel Perrin Shin was the only one who knew the whole truth. How could a man sleep with that knowledge? Today, out of the command office window, he observed another pair of cats setting up across the road from his fort, taking over the old catapult fields. The abandoned farmhouse was being cleaned up, having been claimed by a couple around his age who waved pleasantly as he stalked by that morning. He pulled over his spyglass and focused on the woman hauling crates into the house. Then he pivoted the shaft to get a closer look at the man tying a cow to a tree next to the barn that looked as if it would come down at any moment. Perrin didn't feel even the smallest bit of guilt for watching the man scratch himself in a less than suitable place, sure that no one could see him. The spyglass was, after all, meant to spy on garters. After an hour, Perrin took a quick walk over to the run-down house, the dusty windows already wiped clean, and the sounds of scrubbing coming from the kitchen. He noticed that at the old barn the man was hammering a board against a leaning door frame. Perrin straightened his jacket and marched over to him. Moments before Perrin reached him, the farmer turned around. He blinked rapidly to see Perrin continue his stride and stop only about a foot in front of him. "You're the colonel, aren't you?" the man said, taking a short step backward and almost into his barn. "I am," Perrin said coldly. "And why are you here?" The man blinked at him again, nervously. He was of average height, average weight, brown hair going gray at the temples, and light brown eyes. Nothing remarkable, nothing distinguishable. Exceptionally average, so as to not be memorable in any way. Exactly the kind of man Perrin would have chosen for the task. The man stammered. "I and my wife, of course, we're from Moorland. Lost our home and my mother in the land tremor and heard there were possibilities here. Cambazola Brighter, sir." And he held out his hand to shake Perrin's. Perrin slowly raised his hand and took Brighter's, squeezing it until he heard something pop. The man gasped slightly, and Perrin released his hand. "Bit of a mouthful, the first name there, isn't it?" Brighter said, trying to sound light-hearted, but a trembling undertone gave him away. He shoved his hand into the safety of his trousers pocket. "I was named after 4 different ancestors," he gabbled. "You can shorten it, though. You can call me Cambo, or Zola, or Bozola, and even in school I was called Bozo. So, sir, you may call me—" Perrin focused his glare. "Mr. Brighter will suffice." Cambazola Brighter swallowed hard. "I spoke to your master sergeant some days ago. Said soldiers planted this field, but it needed to be taken care of," he rushed. "My wife is an excellent gardener, sir, and I'm a fair cheesemaker. We've got chickens and plan to buy more cows. The master sergeant said we could provide food to the fort in lieu of payment for the land. We've got some builders lined up to shore up the barn. I meant that sergeant, had us sign a paper and everything." Perrin just nodded once. "Yes," he said tonelessly. "Sergeant Zenas told me. I will personally review the document. How long did you live in Moreland?" Brighter was beginning to sweat, and not, Perrin was sure, because it was a hot weeding day. No matter how well trained the spy, it was a rare man who could withstand a prolonged shin glare. "Most of my life, sir. My family came from Sands, and I've always preferred small villages away from all the bustle. Would never want to be an Idemia, sir. And may I say, sir, sorry about your parents." Perrin nodded again, but doubted this cat was anything but sorry, only surprised that Perrin was already onto him. He looked over at the house. "Is that your wife cleaning in there?" Brighter nodded and cleared his throat. "Yes, Susie. And we have a son, but he's in Mount Scene at the university." "I want to meet your wife." Of course, Brighter said, massaging his hands and running ahead of the colonel to the house. "Susie! Visitor from the fort, Susie!" he called in warning as he ran up the back steps, Perrin stalking after him. The back door opened, and a pleasant enough woman looked out. She glanced at Perrin and stopped. "Oh, my!" "You better be afraid," Perrin thought, "because I don't fear you." "Mrs. Brighter," he said shortly. He shook her hand firmly, but decided not to crush any of her knuckles. She seemed so innocent, so average, maybe a little younger than Mari, with rough, dry hands. She might actually be a gardener, and wouldn't that be the ideal place for her to spend all day watching the fort across the road and the acres of her new farm? Her blue eyes looked as terrified as a rabbit's. "Just so both of you know, I'm watching this land. Perfect view from my tower. I know everything that goes on here in Edge because nothing escapes my attention. Do you understand?" The Brighters nodded vigorously. "Of course, sir, of course," Mr. Brighter said too quickly. "And we appreciate that." Perrin squinted at him. "I don't know why you would, but I will find out." He spun and headed back to the road, leaving the Brighters with their mouths hanging open. Maybe this was why his marks in diplomacy and command school were always his lowest. He didn't see a need to coddle the truth, but to expose it and pierce it, writhing to the ground. "How long did you say this has been going on?" Rector Young asked Shem, who leaned against his mantelpiece, watching the fire. "A few weeks," Shem confessed. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure it was trauma. I thought it was just a temporary disturbance, but I suppose it's the berry that broke the bear." Young nodded sadly and watched the flames as well. "We suspected and feared something like this could happen." Shem shook his head. "But he's so strong. I don't understand." Rector Young put a hand on Shem's arm. "It has nothing to do with strength. It's happened before with others. Sometimes a man just gets pushed too far. And when you look at his history, it's rather inevitable. That Perrin's lasted so long is remarkable." Shem turned to him. "Wait a minute. That's why they sent you, isn't it? I thought it seemed odd you were willing to come back into service, but you knew this would happen, didn't you?" Young shrugged. Suspected, but not knew. With the others, but Shem, furious that he'd been left in the dark, didn't care about any others. He was supposed to be the one shedding light for everyone else. "So why didn't you warn me?" "Shem," Young said patiently, "what else could we have done?" There was no answer for that. Bitterly, Shem turned back to the fire. "So what do we do now?" "We're going to need help. I don't work alone, nor is this a quick fix. Jothan just returned to the forest. We should tell him. Shem closed his eyes and massaged his forehead. Do we have to let them know? While I've seen this before, I'd feel much more comfortable with some assistance. Jothan's the perfect man. Young paused. Shem, why don't you want them to know? It took him a full minute to find the words. I'm worried of what they'll think of him. What they'll think of him? They'll think he needs help. Are you sure? Shem's voice was so tight, so tense, that Young turned the brawny soldier to face him. What's this really about, Shem? His chin trembled as he stammered. What if they decide he's not the one? What if they change their mind or something? Why would they do that? I don't know, Shem nearly wailed, sitting down in Rector Young's only chair, a stuffed piece that was likely twice as big when it was first made decades ago, but now was so worn that it was flat and barely big enough to contain the master sergeant. He held his face in his hands, tears leaking between his fingers. Astonished, Young squatted in front of him and waited. He can do it, Rector. He can do it all, or rather he could have, but now it's all been too much. I feel it. If Jothan tells them, but Shem, nothing's changed. Perrin is still the one. Hifadi believed it, and Glees does too. And I'm more sure of it now than ever before. He's going through this for a reason, Shem. There's a purpose to the pain. There always is. Sometimes it takes us a lifetime to understand it, but eventually we'll see and even be grateful. Shem couldn't look at him. I can't see that right now. I just don't get it. You're not required to get it. You're required to stand at his side. Nothing more, nothing less, the rector assured. The men sat in silence for a few minutes, listening only to the crackling of the fire. Young watched the flames while waiting for Shem to come out of his brooding. Eventually he said, How do they make steel for swords? I'm sorry, Young, but I'm really not in the mood to give you a step-by-step description. They do it with fire, right? Said Young. Smelting iron, then heating it for a long time and processing it in some way, right? Shem sighed. That's the oversimplified version, but yes. Why? Why so much heat and time? Shem sighed louder, as if to emphasize that he really didn't want to discuss this. Because iron is brittle and useless as a weapon, but through sloughing off the impurities, getting rid of the slag, and heating it correctly, it becomes a strong, stable piece of steel. It does, Young agreed, and only by such a grueling, refining process does it become something as fine as what you wear on your hip, a true piece of art and function, able to defend like nothing else in the world can. Shem was crying again, but now for a different reason. Young smiled that he got it. Even as a boy, Shem had been so quick to understand. That was why he was chosen. He's going to make it, isn't he? Shem sniffled. Oh, I believe he is. And when, not if, but when he comes out of all of this, he'll be even more remarkable, won't he? Shem wiped his nose on his sleeve. He'll be everything we anticipated. He will, Shem. Now, please tell Jothan. Get some more minds working on this besides just yours and mine. This is going to take some time, and we'll need reinforcements. In the meantime, you can update me about his behavior, and we can make some plans. Shem exhaled. Do you have any idea how many people I meet, and at different times, and in different places? Young chuckled. No, actually I don't. And I don't envy your schedule. When exactly do you sleep? I'm not even sure myself, he admitted, but I'll be here as often as possible. Tell me one more time, please. He gripped the old man's shoulder. He's going to be great, isn't he? He is, Shem. He is. Grinning through his tears, Shem darted out of Young's back door and into the night. The rector watched him slip into the shadows and smiled. He's going to be just as great as you are, Shem Zenas. The next morning, Shem took the long way back to the fort. Exceptionally long, considering that he was heading south to the market before he went north to the fort. He slipped into the front doors of the inn at Edge, nodded politely to a couple of patrons up for an early breakfast, and made his way to the kitchen door. He pushed it open and smiled dimly at Mrs. Pato. Mrs. Pato looked up from the dough she was kneading and sent back a similarly dismal smile. "Good morning, Master Sergeant, or maybe it isn't." Shem shook his head slightly. "Just wanted you to know." That was all he needed to say to convey that Mari would likely be by later. She nodded and said, without silly preambles, "Stay. I just pulled out some hot rolls. Have some before you go on duty." "I didn't bring any silver with me today, but thank you." "No silver needed," she said. "My treat." Shem knew what society expected next. They should banter back and forth about how that was too kind, but no, and "oh, but I insist," and "oh, but I couldn't." But he didn't have anything left for society's games, and neither did she. Mrs. Pato was weary, trying with Shem to support a family they didn't know how to help. But Mrs. Pato had grown sharper in the past few moons, and was so focused that she hadn't got Shem's ranking wrong in weeks. "Thanks," he said simply, and took the plate she offered him, with 4 rolls still steaming. He was grateful the eating room was mostly empty, and that the sun's light hadn't reached it yet. The muted silence was restful as he bit into a warm roll, honey glaze sliding down his fingers. "Well, hello, my old friend." Shem stopped chewing and looked up at the creature that emitted the crooning noise which destroyed his peace. "Serene! What a surprise!" He tried to sound pleasant, but it was as useless as being happy about discovering a hole in your tooth. "So, you made it back to Edge after all, I see." Again, he knew what society expected, but he was depleted of energy and even good manners. The best he could manage was to gesture to the chair across from him at the table. Serene either wasn't too discerning, or she was simply that desperate, that she cheerfully accepted his half-hearted invitation and sat down with a variety of tinkling noises. The multiple chains on her arm clanked together like an accident at the blacksmith's. She leaned forward adoringly, chin resting on her hands in an odd manner which she likely thought was alluring, and fluttered her eyelashes as if something was stuck on them. Shem struggled with a yawn. It was too early in the morning. Serene sat up, insulted. "I was going to say you're looking quite well, but you're a bit baggy under the eyes. Maybe even have a black eye forming? Have an eventful night?" Something crisp in her tone confused Shem. There was likely a multitude of meanings behind her question, but he didn't bother to work them out. "A bit," he said as he shoved the last of his roll into his mouth. "Always something going on around here," he garbled. "Well, you look quite—" She tilted her head in evaluation. "Extraordinary. Always were a fine example of manhood and soldiering." She raised her eyebrows suggestively, but Shem didn't know what she was suggesting, especially at this hour. Serene hadn't changed much over the years. She was the first and only girl he'd ever kissed, not by his choice, but as a requirement for the first strongest soldier race. Yet he was fairly confident he wasn't the only male she'd ever kissed. Women like her didn't realize that stories got around about women like her. Serene was as attractive to Shem now as she had been a dozen years ago, which meant a mud puddle was more enticing and likely cleaner. She was waiting for his compliment, but all he noticed was that she'd put on some weight over the years, making her rounder and softer, but he didn't know how to politely say, "And you've become fat, but it works for you." Then again, it did make her abundant cleavage rather unappetizing. Her dark hair was a mass of something on her head, probably intended to look sultry, but was sloppy, and her eyes were clouded. All he could come up with was, "And you look well, too." Realizing that was all she was going to get, she said, "I'm surprised the village looks so good. I wasn't going to come back until I heard the reports that Edge was rebuilding quite nicely." "Soldiers are doing most of the work," Shem said dismissively. He picked up his second roll. "They're also rebuilding some of the shops," Serene mentioned. "I was thinking of buying a small one to sell books in." Shem shrugged and chewed. "Already have a bookseller, one of the few shops that survived." Serene rolled her eyes dramatically as if she were 17 again. "But what he sells is so dull. There are new books, you know. Exciting ones. All about women and men and relationships." Shem noticed something happening around his leg, as if a cat was marking him on the outside of his boot. He glanced down to notice Serene's bare foot rubbing his leg. Since that was the oddest thing he'd ever experienced, he crossed his legs, removing his calf from her easy access. Serene smiled in what she likely thought was a coy manner, and repositioned herself on the chair. Maybe she had an itchy foot, Shem considered, that she felt the need to scratch it now on his thigh. "What makes you think people will be interested in these relationship books?" Shem asked, only to be polite. "Oh, they're interesting, all right," Serene said, with a lusty chuckle. That's when Shem noticed her perpetual giggle was gone, replaced by something deeper and creepier. "So, what's new in Edge? Besides everything, I mean." Shem tried to think of something. "Rigoff and Karna were transferred to Rivers." "I know all of that," she said, suddenly bored. She slid her foot from his thigh. "I visited Tyria after they moved. Rivers' captain lives in something grander than Edge's colonel. And as for Karna's intended, Miss Robbing is far too serious. But I guess if he likes her," she curled her lip. "Wedding's supposed to be next week sometime. They're keeping it small." "I know," Shem said, playing with some crumbs. "Brillin wrote to all of us. Marriage will be good for him." "Be good for you, too," Serene murmured. When Shem only looked at the table again, she continued. "Tyria said there have been stories." She whispered the last word. "About what?" Shem tore apart a roll. "About Colonel Shin." Serene leaned forward, her cleavage nearly crushing Shem's remaining rolls. He slid them to safety. "Has he really lost his mind?" Every muscle in Shem clenched. "No! Who's saying such things?" She sat back and folded her arms in something like tinkling triumph. "Shem, people talk. When there's no entertainment, people go looking for it. The rumors have traveled all the way down into Rivers. Quake's probably heard a few stories about the sad and terrifying, or should I say terrified, commander of Edge." Shem's left hand bunched up as if a long knife were in it. "Well, people are wrong," he hissed. "He's been dealing with more than anyone can imagine. Can't he grieve in privacy? Can't he live his life without everyone peeking through the windows to gawk? That he continues is astonishing. What his family endures is commendable. How Mari copes is nothing short of miraculous. Tell people that if they want something to talk about." An odd smile formed on Serene's face. "Well, then, I will. So tell me, Shemzinas, what's going on with you? When I wrote to Miss Murray last season, she said you were still devoted to soldiering. Still looking for the right woman to be devoted to?" Shem sighed, relieved for a change of topic, even an uncomfortable one. "I don't know, just not the right time yet." She scoffed. "You're in your 30s, Shem. So am I. So when will the right time be?" He shoved the rest of the second roll into his mouth and wrapped the remaining two in his handkerchief. "I need to be going to the fort, Serene. I wish you well with your bookshop. He made to leave, but Serene grabbed his arm. Can I see you again? He shrugged, gently pulling out of her grip as he stood. I'm on double duty frequently, what with rebuilding and everything. So if I came by the fort? I can't really say, Serene. Hard to find me sometimes. He headed for the door, but heard, So if I go to the Shins, I'll still find you there, won't I? Her tone turned icy. People talk, Zenas, and they're wondering if the death of his parents is the only thing filling Perrin Shin with anxiety. It was the insinuation that stopped him in his tracks and made the back of his neck tingle, as if her glare were singeing him. So that was the kind of relationship books she was reading, the kind that led her to assume everyone lives as poorly as in the stories. He refused to acknowledge her accusation, but to the kitchen he called out, Thank you for the rolls, Mrs. Pato, as he left. Mari set out for her regular walk through Edge to the cottages where her mother lived. To make things easier, she kept her head down as she tromped along the cobblestones. She didn't want to meet anyone's face, nor did she want them to have to abide seeing hers. Besides, now when she really could have used a little more friendliness in her life, everyone in Edge pulled back to a safe distance. From the corners of her eyes, she could see the villagers' feet scuffling away to give her plenty of room as she passed. Blessedly, there were a couple of people she could always count on. One was Rector Young, who frequently stopped by and attempted to talk to Perrin, who always suddenly had something else to do. The other was her mother. 2 minutes later, she sat on Heisman Pato's pink sofa, painted with purple flowers and woven with garish threads of gold and green. All Mari noticed, though, was that her mother had slipped a thick cloth onto her shoulder today, in anticipation. Heisman patted her on the back as if she were a messy infant as Mari sobbed on her shoulder. Mari, I mean it. You and the children stay here for a few days. Let him do whatever he's doing, but you get a rest. Just when it looks like things are getting better, they get worse again. Mari sniffled. I can't leave him, Mother. He needs us. Someday he may actually be glad. She couldn't finish because she didn't know if her husband would ever be glad for anything ever again. Not that long ago, she had cried and chuckled about how blessed her life was, how many miracles had struck them in such a short amount of time. She didn't realize that the outpouring then was to make up for the drought now. At least I know where my husband went, but yours? Heisman patted her daughter again. Who knows where his mind is sometimes? I heard he confronted some weaver yesterday until Shem led him away. Mari sighed. I'll add him to the list of those I need to visit and apologize to. What do people think about him, Mother? What do they say? Heisman sighed back. People think that the colonel's been issued orders to interrogate people in Edge, because the administrators suspect that Garters are still after him and his family. Mari pondered that. I suppose that works. I wonder where that came from. I think it was Rector Young. I heard him say that a few weeks ago to the new couple living over by the fort. You know, for a rector, he's a pretty decent gossip. Mari smiled miserably. He must have been talking to the Briders. I already paid them an apology visit. Perrin was sure they were spies, but they were the gentlest, kindest, and now most terrified couple I've ever met. They liked me, at least. So, what happened last night? Heisman asked her daughter as she smoothed her hair. At least you visit me more often. She tried to say that light-heartedly, but even silly Heisman Pato had lost a great deal of her inanity since Ralph and Joriana Shin were killed by Garters as they slept. Some level of her intellect, usually absorbed by cloth and cooking and decorating, had realized that if her son-in-law's parents were intended targets, she might be too. Mari sniffed. Sometimes he does so well. 3 nights, no incidents. He almost smiles, then it's all back again. I make him tell me what he sees. Shem said that's what the book said to do. Make him speak it and realize it's not real. Heisemem shifted nervously. What does he see? Mari could tell she really didn't want to know it all, but it helped her to say it out loud. Variations on the same theme, dirtied men in black, daggers and knives, sometimes swords. His family lying still in pools of blood. He arriving moments too late. Heisemem shuddered. Oh, how often do you give him that stuff? That's the problem. I quit after he's had a few good nights. He's fine on his own for a night or so, but then it starts again. So just keep snuffing him. Sedating him, Mari clarified. Whatever. Just a little each night. But we don't know how it might affect him taking it for so long, Mari fretted. No one knows, not even Dr. Brizak. I'm supposed to report to him each week about Perrin's reactions. Lovely, Heisemem said with uncharacteristic sarcasm, using Perrin as a test squirrel. If Chairman Mao knew that his citizens were being tested on, he likely would ask for a copy of the results himself, Mari told her mother. I haven't sent back any reports, though. I don't want them to know what's going on here. I just keep praying. I know, Heisemem said. I talked to Rector Young the other day. He told me he sees you quite frequently. Mari nodded. He's a sweet man. I feel he says to me exactly what Hogel would have advised. He's trying to get Perrin to talk to him, but on mornings like this... She sighed and wiped away another tear. Mother, last night we sat on the sofa talking together about the day, the new lieutenants, the obnoxious captain, about he and Shem need to come up with new facial codes for Lemuel Thorne, so he won't know they're talking about him. He even smiled last night. I felt safe snuggling up to him the way I always did. Then, only a few hours later, he was screaming through the house, swinging that sword. Heisemem patted her daughter again. Someday he just might hit something or someone, and then there will be a tragedy. Half an hour later, Mari left her mother's, a bit dehydrated but feeling lighter for the good cry. She skirted the marketplace and took a longer way home by the old rectory that used to belong to Hogel and Tabit Denzel, but was now cared for by a tiny old man who worked in his front garden. Morning, noon, and night, Young was outside, pulling the weeds from his manicured beds of vegetables, or pruning fruit trees that still had a few late blossoms. The fruit, Mari knew, would be shared with whomever passed and wanted an apple or a pear. And then there were his herbs. Mari stopped a couple of houses away to watch the narrow man trimming his basil and parsley, already green and bushy, into tiny trees. The leaves which he clipped off he carefully gathered. Something in Mari's chest burned, then crumbled as she watched him. She'd always had dreams, glorious, baffling dreams about a large house, a faded gray wood. There were fuzzy elements that remained whenever she woke, and she desperately tried to hold on to them, yet the details faded away as she grew more alert. But there were a few constants. Always the house, and mountains, and children, more than two, and window boxes filled with herbs. That was the most puzzling thing about the dream, the herbs. She'd never tried to grow any herself because there wasn't any aspect of gardening that ever struck her as enjoyable. But in her dreams she sat in a garden and weeded happily. She decided some time ago the dream was symbolic, although she could never grasp what the symbols meant. Once, briefly a few years ago, she entertained the notion that maybe the house was a peek at some future life, a distant reality, if only she could perform well and long enough. But it was impossible. There were no more children in her future. Even if she didn't have to take the drink that cramped her womb into a barren nothingness, She and Perrin were in their mid-40s now, too old to be new parents again. So she shoved the dream back into a section of her mind she called mysterious and frustrating, maybe symbolic, definitely perplexing. She hoped recategorizing it might make the brutal fantasy go away. But still, she dreamed every year a dozen times. She'd wake up smiling, see the faint outline of the house, then wretchedly watch it dissolve like sugar in water. There was simply nowhere to go with it, so she tried to ignore it, as she tried to ignore the small dog yapping at her right now through a fence. And just like the dog, there's only so long you can pretend that you don't notice it. It's only your mind that's not accepting the harsh reality. Mari, in pure frustration, kicked the fence with all of her might. The mangy beast yelped as if she'd actually hit it, and ran for the house, while Mari began walking as if she hadn't the faintest idea why the animal was now barking at her from the safety of the porch. She slowed her gait in front of Rector Young's house, and he automatically looked up. His narrow eyes turned into slits as his gentle and wide smile took over most of his face. "Mrs. Shin, how lovely to see you. May I interest you in some fresh basil? It's just growing wild on me this year. Or parsley?" Earlier, something in Mari's chest had burned, then crumbled. Now the fragments tried to smolder pitifully again as she stared at the herbs the rector offered her. "Thank you." She arranged them in her hand, and their pungency filled her nose. For some reason, the scent reminded her of that night years ago when she ran into the forest to question garters, surprised herself by finding a female one, then ran back out again because the woman knew her name. She'd sat sobbing under a pine tree so fragrant that whenever she passed a similar species, the scent brought back the memory with embarrassing intensity. The combination of basil and parsley was only slightly similar to the pine, but still she could see that night so clearly before her, and the woman hooded in a black cloak who chided her. She looked back at the sweetness of Rector Young as an escape from that recollection, but still it remained, somehow blurring him into the picture where he didn't belong. "Mrs. Shin," he said gently, reading all sorts of mixed emotions on her face. "How are you?" It wasn't a pleasantry. It was a deeply concerned question. All she could do in response was shrug. Rector Young put a fatherly arm around her waist. Even as short as Mari was, so was Rector Young, so that he could never put an arm around anyone's shoulders. And he gave her a little squeeze that conveyed far more warmth and love than she'd felt from the entire village. "May I drop by later, when he's home?" Mari sighed heavily. "He was very bad last night." Young nodded once. "I know. Shem told me. I have some ideas that might help." Mari stared at the herb scenting her hands. "You can try, but I don't know how he'll respond." Young squeezed her again. "If you're worried that I'll be offended by his reactions, don't be. Nothing offends me." Then, as if he just thought of it, he continued with, "Have you ever fed a puppy that was abandoned by its mother?" Mari looked blankly at him. No. Is this another Flax Waves saying?" Young smiled. "Well, sort of. When a puppy is abandoned, others need to step in and feed it. But often the puppy doesn't want the milk that can sustain it. Maybe it's too hurt from its loss, or it doesn't recognize the milk source, or it's just too weak or sad. But still you try, hour after hour, because if you don't, that poor creature, suffering through no fault of his own, will die." He whispered the last words, and Mari closed her eyes. He nudged her gently to open them again. "But we don't quit, Mrs. Shin. Hour after hour, day after day, until some of that milk gets into that mouth. We keep trying until something opens up and accepts what all of us are trying to give him." Tears trickled down her cheeks, even though she was sure she was on empty. "Thank you," she whispered. "I agree. We never give up. I'd invite you for dinner, but those are angry affairs now." Her chin trembled violently until she regained control of it again. To his credit, Rector Young pretended he didn't notice. "I have other plans for dinner anyway, but I'll be by later, just to see if our puppy's interested yet. If not, I'll try again, and again, and again." Mari leaned her head against his shoulder, thinking that her father Cephas would have done the same for her. As she left to go home a few minutes later, she turned back to wave at Rector Young, but he had already gone into his house. Mari sniffed the herbs and wondered if the only reason the man's garden was so immaculate was because he worked out there all day, waiting for her. That's the end of chapter 2. Thank you.